Oh, by the way, I've disabled the announcement, so we are
Oh,
recording.
oh, okay. Well, welcome everyone for another edition of Huddle. Thanks for joining us this week. And this may or may not be, I'm guessing it may be the last Huddle of the year. So I don't know that it's going to be extra special, but it'll be a good one. We're going to
Special
really
welcome to
focus.
Felicia, though, from Logan. What's up, Felicia?
Oh, Felicia Lilly from Logan. Okay, welcome. Am I pronouncing your name right, Felicia from Lilly from Logan? Okay.
Yes, you are. Thank
Okay.
you.
Well, welcome, Felicia. And by the way, this forum is really to answer any real estate related questions. So don't be too shy to chime in, offer your opinion, even if it's in contrast to mine. That's totally fine. If you need some questions answered on your transaction, this is also a good forum place to present them. If you're not feeling too hesitant to have a whole bunch of people hear about it. And so today we are going to focus on some addenda that we had not discussed in the past. And as you know, that's kind of what I like to do. We like to talk about transactional issues, addenda, and that type of thing. I think the first thing that we're going to talk about is kind of an interesting subject that comes up from time to time before we jump into the addenda. But this has to do with the default of the opposing party. So regardless of what side of the transaction you're on, you will from time to time discover that the other party is in default. And today I got a good question about from an agent regarding we represent the buyer in this transaction, and the seller has not delivered all the seller's disclosures in the proper amount of time. And this one had to do, I think, with title policy. And the question was, well, can we sort of keep this default in our back pocket in case things go south in the future? So essentially preserving the default to use it at a time where it would be more advantageous for us to use this default. So in this instance, they said, well, there's some things going on with financing in this transaction, and it's probably going to go okay, but what if it doesn't? In 2 weeks, can we come back and say, hey, you were in default, and that's how we're getting out of this transaction? The short answer to that is, if you are the agent representing your clients and you discover default, your choices are really pretty simple. You can either deal with the default immediately and call them out on it and attempt to address it, or in effect, you are passing up on your ability to call them out in the future. And the logic is really simple. Your actions are dictating that you accept it if you're not dealing with it. So if in this instance they didn't deliver the title policy on time, 2 or 3 weeks later you're set to close and something happens and you go, hey, we can't really get out of it in any other format other than to say, hey, seller, by the way, 3 weeks ago you were in default because you did not deliver all the seller's disclosures on time, and for that reason we're backing out and keeping our earnest money. Your actions for 3 weeks determine that you did not care about that default and that you were okay with it and you proceeded anyway. That would be the argument if I was on the other side of the table that I would make. It says, no, you don't care about that default because you just proceeded through the transaction and acted as if it was okay. So be aware of that. And be aware of that argument regardless of if you're on the bad end or the good end of that argument. If somebody calls you out 2 weeks later on a problem, you say, no, I can't really accept that. You move forward in this transaction as if you didn't care, and we proceeded without that problem presenting itself. So just be aware of that. It's not, oh, sorry, my chat isn't up, and there's a chat. Is this a quiz question? No, it is not a quiz question, though. If I would have prepared one, maybe I could come up with a good, I should start it that way. I should present the question and then people answer it, and it's funner that way. It is funner that way. So anyway, be aware of that. And before we move on to this next addenda, any questions on that, or does anybody have any experience related to default that didn't get presented in a timely fashion? Probably not off the top of your head. By the way,
Mike,
yeah, hit it.
it's Scott Raven. I've seen on pro standards where I've been on a hearing where someone has tried to make the case because something else went wrong. And the committee's like, nope, it was clear. You had your chance there. It's irrelevant now.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a pretty common it's a pretty common argument for people to make to dispute that, right? Putting the default in your back pocket. It's easily dispelled, right? But people still, because they're unaware of it, they will attempt to do those things. And of course, remember, that's if you're not aware of the default, but it's our job as agents to be aware of the transaction and the language around it and the consequences of not adhering to the transaction. That's our job, to follow that and make sure everybody's handling the transaction as it needs to be handled. So ignorance isn't really a good excuse either for us. Anyway, all right, let's move on to a few addenda we haven't talked about in the past. And as usual, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat or speak up. Just unmute yourself and we'll get going. So the first one we're going to talk about, oh, by the way, Joe, can you make me a host so I can share? The first one we're going to talk about is the subject to seller securing a replacement property. So interestingly enough, I have been involved in some a lawsuit around this addenda and its misconception of what you can actually do with this addenda. So this is a really good example of one of the only reasons that a seller can create for themselves to exit a transaction. And it's really the only, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the only seller condition that I know of, right? Our buyers have many conditions. They have a due diligence and a finance and appraisal condition. And this is the only instance that I can think of off the top of my head of a seller creating a condition for themselves. And the condition is actually really simple. It's subject to seller securing replacement property. And remember, read that language again, securing replacement property. So paragraph A, subject to seller securing replacement property. Seller's obligation to sell the property is conditioned, and it's called the subject to seller securing property replacement property condition, upon seller entering into a contract to purchase or lease a replacement property and being satisfied with the replacement property's physical condition, appraised value, and or financing conditions by 5 p.m. on this date. Seller, in seller's sole discretion, may remove this condition at any time prior to the replacement property deadline by providing written notice to buyer. Okay. Paragraph B, seller's right to cancel. If seller, in seller's sole discretion, is not satisfied with the replacement property or has not secured a replacement property, then seller may cancel the REPC by providing buyer with written notice no later than the replacement property deadline, whereupon the earnest money shall be released to the buyer without the requirement of further written authorization. It's failure to cancel. If seller fails to cancel the REPC by the replacement property deadline, then the seller shall be deemed to have waived the subject to seller securing replacement property condition. So that's really simple. I think there's not a lot of scenarios in which that could benefit us, or excuse me, benefit the seller. But you have been in scenarios where a seller's like, hey, I'm not moving unless I find the right property. If you do get in that situation, I would recommend that you advise your seller that that is one of the first things you lead out with to potential buyers. I don't think it's probably a good strategy to have a buyer be unaware of the impending addendum that's about to come their way, the subject to seller securing a replacement property. So I think that's something we should lead out with. By the way, we're going to throw this addendum at you when you submit an offer, because the seller does want to have a property in place before they sell this one. Also, if anybody's on the forms committee, that is a really long name for an addenda, and I would appreciate you making it simpler somehow. Anyway, has anyone ever used this document or has attempted to use this document? And Travis has unmuted himself, which makes me think he wants to contribute. So Travis, take it away.
I do, but I would love to hear if somebody has actually used the addenda and the outcome of it, because I will tell you. Well, I want to see if there's an answer to that first.
I've used it, but it was a long time ago.
Long time ago. Yeah, Tyler, I've actually only seen it twice in my 30 years of doing this, and both times it created absolute chaos. It created animosity between the buyers and sellers, and so on and so forth, and so much so to go back and renegotiate. And the reason I took myself off of mute is recognize the buyer's lender, regardless of who that is, cannot participate in additional fee reconciliation if that transaction ends up canceling, right? The buyer is out those total third-party fees. They have the right to go back and sue, but they accepted those terms. And the only reason I bring that up, Mr. Mike, is so you can address that issue right there, right? So if you are ever either representing a buyer or a seller in that transaction, just recognize the buyer's lender will have third-party fees that have already been spent on that transaction. The buyer cannot recoup those because they have agreed to that seller's addenda before they move forward with the transaction. So just heads up on that one.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up. This addendum is actually really, it does have a lot of problems associated with it. I think when you think about our purchase contract, I think we all realize by design that purchase contract heavily favors the buyer, and for very good reason. And then when you throw this on top of it, now it does swing the scales heavily towards the seller, and it does create many problems. You may come about a situation more commonly in the commercial world, or if you are helping your client complete a 1031 exchange. Many people who want to complete 1031 exchanges, they go, hey, I'm definitely happy to sell my property, but I don't want to do it unless I can complete this exchange. And so I want the ability to go out and find my own replacement property, and I won't close until I have done so. And I will also say that, yes, I have successfully completed a few of those in my time. And every single one of them was probably, and I have a horrible memory, but they all do seem to feel like they mirrored Travis's experience where people ended up hating each other. But sometimes you just have to have a little animosity to close a transaction. I mean, we don't prefer that. Let's just be clear. We don't prefer that, but sometimes that does happen. But yeah, people can hide behind this addenda and not be honest about it. So just know that if your seller is forcing you into a situation where you're just like, okay, this is the only solution we have for you, seller, is to respond to every offer with the subject to seller securing replacement property addendum, just know that it could be problematic. By the way, Travis, you did unmute yourself. Take it away.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I did see you unmute yourself and about to contribute here. Do you have anything?
I was actually just going to make one other comment. I didn't say this earlier, but your example of a 1031, one of them was a 1031 where the seller was trying to, find a replacement property. The other thing, just to note on that, which Albino pinged me behind the scenes, the complications of a lock for the buyer as well. So it's just there are a number of things that if you're representing a buyer in that scenario, pick up the phone, call your lender, your buyer's lender, and walk through some of those hypothetical questions. I think we all do that as professionals anyway, but it's always just a good rule of thumb to take that extra step.
Yeah, use this as I don't know that I would call it a last resort, but if you are pushed into a situation, know that there is something that can protect you with this, and it is this addendum. But make sure you do educate everybody on the potential perils of this addendum. So, all right, moving on. We're going to also discuss, I did pick a lot of obscure, rarely used addendum as the theme for this huddle. So let's go to one of my all-time favorite obscure addendum, which is the reinstatement of Rep C addendum. And, this is one that I think should be used more than it is, which it's very, very rarely used. And I do think there are some applications here. Just know that if you get to a closing table and you have issues and people fight about those issues and the deal falls apart within a few days of closing and you do not get to a closing table, and then somehow you work it out a few days after closing, you do have this handy dandy addendum to simply reinstate the Rep C and make your way to a closing table. So let's just read first paragraph. Acknowledgement of prior cancellation. Buyer and seller acknowledge that the Rep C was previously canceled by buyer in accordance with, some condition. Paragraph 2, reinstatement of Rep C. Notwithstanding the prior cancellation referenced above, buyer and seller wish to proceed forward with this transaction and reinstate the Rep C. Accordingly, upon the mutual acceptance of this addendum, buyer and seller agree that their respective rights and obligations under the Rep C, including all prior addendum and counteroffers, are reinstated in their entirety and are in full force and effect. Buyer and seller further agree that the contract deadlines referenced in Section 24 of the Rep C and as modified by any prior addenda and counteroffers are modified as follows below. So you do have the ability to create new deadlines for all your conditions, your due diligence, finance, and appraisal, and settlement deadlines to get that party started again. But I also think you need to keep in mind time. I think, I don't know that there's an exact time in which this addendum becomes a little harder to push forward, but it does seem a few weeks is probably too much. A week seems kind of maybe that rule of thumb spot. Kimberly says, I have used that reinstatement of Rep C addenda and it was great. By the way, kudos to Kimberly DeVries, the best multitasker of the Huddle, currently getting her hair done and responding to chat. Yeah, very impressive. So that in and of itself deserves some kind of recognition. Scott says, me too. Kevin suggested it. Yeah, I think there's plenty of instances where you can just slide this addendum in and just get yourself to a closing table and it works great. Travis, do you see any issues that a lender may have with this addendum?
Well, yes. Well, there's so from a lender's perspective, Mike, there's always timing components, right? So while we change our dates and the timing component, there's several different things that a buyer has to do, right? The obvious ones are financing. The second one is collateral. The third one would be a lock and timing of it. I think that if we go back, like Kim and Scott both have used it, as long as we go back and clean the slate for the buyer, there's not really too many challenges, but again, it's attention to details, right? Ignorance is not bliss, right, Mike? That's what I would say.
Okay, I'll believe most of the time. I agree.
Most of the time.
Okay. Well, yeah, this does feel like something that we need to have really good conversations with our lending partners before we just up and get this signed, because we may create a scenario that isn't entirely beneficial to everyone. So mind your P's and Q's here. Make sure you get that done with the lender's blessing. Any questions on that? Anybody else other than Kim and Scott who have used and implemented this addenda? Has anybody attempted to do it and it has failed? Anything along those lines? I think this is, of course, I don't know how many deals I can think of in the last 12 months that have really failed right at the closing table and we've scrambled to put something together, but it definitely does happen. And those problems do exist. I mean, that's why we all have anxiety about closing and getting paid, because, even when the parties show up and they all close, we're still have some sense of anxiety until we're like, oh, we're done, we're recorded. That's the only time we actually feel like the deal's closed. So maybe that's why they created this addendum. Scott says ours was at the end of due diligence. Yeah, well, that's actually, I'm glad you said that, Scott. This can be used at any time. It doesn't have to be at the end of the closing table. You could have canceled for any reason, and you can simply slide this in and reinstate the REPC. Thank you for saying that. I don't know why I wouldn't have pointed that out. But yeah, this can be used at any time to reinstate any deal at any moment in time. And that's why they left the REPC deadlines to remain unchanged, because you can just put that baby back into effect in 2 days.
So,
All right, let's go ahead.
Mike, just one more thing there. Um, it's only happened a handful of times, but the original REPC terms and addenda that were agreed upon, right? If a seller is giving a seller credit, as an example, or if there's a personal property transfer agreement that's separate to the purchase contract, those types of things, the more complex the original contract was, the more important this addenda is, right? So while I said there's not, as long as you're paying attention to details, there's not too many hiccups. But I think that was kind of the point that I was trying to make, right? Is the more complex the original one was, the more important the details of your addenda are, especially if you're not modifying, right?
Yeah, makes good sense. All right, feels like we may have worked our way through the reinstatement of REPC addenda. Anybody have any other comments on that subject or anything else? Oh, Kimberly says, same, we canceled to save them before due diligence ended when the listing agent wasn't responding. Yeah, that's a really good use of it. I think, if we feel like a deal can survive exactly as Kimberly has described, yeah, she had to cancel. She couldn't risk her client's earnest money. And when people are non-responsive, we have to cancel. But just know you could put that together without writing entire new offers. You can have one addendum to rule them all in this instance, and put that baby back together. So really good examples on best use of this addendum. Thank you, Kimberly. All right, I think we are going to, no, I don't think, I know we are going to discuss the short-term leaseback addendum. And I feel like over the years we have discussed this a few times, and it has gone back and forth from being a standalone document. Well, I think it started as an addendum, then became a standalone document, and now it's back in the addendum format. And the short-term leaseback addendum. And I know that for really good reason, people are uncomfortable with sellers staying beyond their closing date. And we know that there's some instances in which those things are really important. I think, some people do play fast and loose with the possession box, right? When are they going to take possession? Well, they'll just take possession in a week, right? I think, again, there's no good rule of, there's no rule here about how long someone should, the longest you should stretch out that possession timeline. But I think you're pushing it at 4 or 5 days to where you're taking some, and again, I'm a broker, so I'm paranoid about everything. I think if you're pushing it 4 and 5 days or 6 days, I think you're pushing the envelope on a legal liability there without putting in something in its place to really handle that time frame. So that's why we have the short-term leaseback addendum, so people can occupy this property for an extended period of time after closing, and it protects both the seller and the buyer, and obviously creates a rental agreement. And you need these things in place to protect everybody. So I know they can be a pain in the butt, but I think we need to dig in when people do this and make sure this addendum gets in place. So let's dive into this. This is a legally binding addendum to the REPC for seller's rental of the property after closing. If buyer is financing the purchase of the property, either as the primary residence or as a second home, then buyer may be obligated to take occupancy of the property within a set period of time specified by buyer's lender after closing. Buyer is strongly advised to consult with buyer's lender regarding the potential impact of this addendum, especially if the rental period, defined below in section 2A, is 60 days or longer. And before we dive in, feels like Travis should have a shot at that statement. Travis, what do you think the average timeline that you're seeing for someone to actually occupy the real estate that they just got a loan on?
Mike, it feels like Huddle mortgage day to day.
It does.
Mortgage Thursdays. You know, Mike, this happens, and you know, I don't want to call Tyler out, but I'm confident that he and his peer groups here in Park City use it all the time because that's where we see it mostly, right? Especially when we have, you know, potentially an Airbnb or something, a short-term rental. I mean, it gets used all the time. This is not uncommon. But we typically don't like to extend beyond 30 days for Fannie Mae requirements, right? So Fannie's starting to tighten that up specifically because we have short-term rentals. 60 days is also not uncommon, but when we exceed 60 days, most lenders are most conforming loans will not allow a 60-day window. You can convert that to a longer term as long as you're doing a non-QM. Non-QM then has direct buyer impact with rate and fee and cost, et cetera. So 30 days, guys, if you can stick to a 30-day window, it's very advantageous to your buyers. When you go beyond that, it is absolutely critical that we confirm first the lender in a conforming and high balance world will allow it. And then thirdly, we point out there are different use cases on those properties as well. So my advice to you on this one is if there is an ADU on the property, this does not solve an ADU issue. So I have seen that more recently in the last probably 18 months or so, where we're trying to use a lease back addenda to solve an ADU lease issue, and you cannot do that. Your buyer cannot close on that property in a conforming loan with an ADU that's occupied by a renter. So keep that in mind, right? You cannot extend occupancy due to an ADU, and that typically falls in mother-in-law suites, et cetera. So a lot to unpack there, guys, but the form, don't be scared of it. We use it pretty consistently. Again, I don't want to call Tyler or anyone else out in Park City, but that's where we see it a high percentage of the time.
Okay. And next time I plan on calling you every 5 minutes for Huddle. I'll let you know beforehand.
I love it.
Again, in my defense, I don't plan these very well. So anyway, moving on. Leaseback. So paragraph 1. Seller desires to remain in the property on a short-term basis after closing. B. Buyer agrees to lease the property to seller, and seller agrees to lease the property from buyer. And C. Buyer and seller agree that Section 3.3 of the REPC is modified so that the lease of the property is not by separate written agreement, and that the seller shall deliver physical possession of the property according to the terms and conditions set forth below. And the all-important line, D, the terms of this addendum shall survive closing, refer to Will Cooper's Zombies in the Rep C, CE class for shall survive after closing. All right, paragraph 2, terminal lease back and payment of rent. A, the lease back of this property shall start on the closing day, shall start on date of closing and shall continue until this day. Rent shall be X for the entire rental period. And 2, payment of the rent shall be delivered by seller to buyer no later than the closing in the form of fill in the blank. Buyer and seller agree that seller may shorten the rental period by providing buyer with written notice of up to X days prior to delivering possession of the property to buyer. All right, there's a couple things there. I know that there is a really strong tendency to put zeros in here, and not have any payment. And in general, I think those things are okay. And are usually largely market driven, right? Sellers may have a lot of power and may have the ability to negotiate no payments during this time frame. But I would always encourage you, obviously, if we represent buyers, even if it's a seller's market, I would encourage you to put some kind of money in there, because these could have long lasting effects, and to have somebody, overstay their welcome and we are not collecting any rent from them can be problematic. All right, moving on. B, proration of rent. In the event the rental period is shortened by seller, buyer and seller agree that the rent shall not be prorated, or that the rent shall be prorated from the day seller delivers possession to the original rental period and date. Again, this is a really good example of the reason we have this rental agreement in place in the first place. is to protect everyone in the transaction. And when we agree to virtually no money exchanged for the consideration of this agreement, it can create problems if things go bad. If things go well, we never need agreements if things go perfectly. We only create them in case that things go horribly. And when they go bad, we want some money associated with that scenario, okay? Utilities, this is obviously important. The utility charges will be the responsibility of seller or buyer as checked below. If no box is checked, then the seller shall be responsible for the utility charges. I mean, I can't imagine a scenario in which the buyer would agree to be responsible for these things. So just if we represent buyers, never check them, ever, ever, ever. All right, in the event the seller is responsible for a utility charge that a utility provider requires to be in the buyer's name, seller shall pay for the utility charge within 7 days of buyer providing seller an invoice of the utility charge. Notwithstanding the utilities above, buyer and seller agree that during the rental period, seller shall be responsible for payment of all cable, satellite TV, and internet, landscape maintenance, snow removal, unless such services are provided by a homeowners association. If applicable, buyer shall be responsible for all homeowners association dues and fees after closing, unless section 4.2 and 4.3 of the REPC state otherwise. Travis says, for buyer's agents, be sure you negotiate HOI to remain in place for the seller during occupation. Very good point. Very good point. Yeah, I think most people would miss that. And I think a lot of sellers probably would cancel their homeowners association, or come on, brain, their home insurance. But that's a really good point, Travis. Thanks for bringing that up. Make sure the seller keeps their policy in place. All right, this paragraph is really important. Security deposits. Seller agrees to deliver to buyer no later than closing a security deposit in the amount of X. In the form of X, the security deposit is to secure the performance of seller's obligation under the leaseback. Seller shall not have the right to apply the security deposit towards the payment of rent. Refund of the security deposit is subject to the requirements of Utah law and also dependent upon seller's compliance with all of the seller's obligations under the leaseback, including delivering the property to buyers as provided in section 6 below, within 30 days after the seller surrenders the property to buyer, or seller providing buyer a forwarding address, whichever is later, buyer will forward to seller the security deposit, less all deductions. Buyer will provide seller with an itemized list of any deductions made. For statutory reference regarding security deposits, see Utah Code yakety yak. Okay. Kimmy asks, does the addendum state to sellers to get renter's insurance? Good question. Let's find out. Default, penalty for holdover, use of the property, liability, lease back. Here's the paragraph that answers these questions. So we'll just answer them right now because you asked, Kimmy. Paragraph 12, seller's insurance. Seller understands that seller is required to secure renter's insurance to protect against damage or loss to seller's personal property and from liability claims that occur on the property. Seller is strongly advised to consult with their own insurance agent to determine and obtain such insurance coverage during the rental period prior to closing. Upon written request by buyer, seller shall provide buyer with a copy of the seller's renter insurance policy within 4 days of buyer's written request. And then they talk about buyer's insurance. Buyers advise that buyer's rental of the property may significantly impact the availability and cost of insurance coverage prior to closing. Buyer is strongly advised to consult with their own insurance agent to determine and obtain adequate insurance coverage for the property during the rental period. So there's your answer. Yes, they are. Let's talk about liability and solving problems. Security deposit. I want you to keep in mind that if you have agreed to essentially very little or no payments, rental payments, the security deposit is of the utmost importance. You do not pass go with zero security deposit amounts in there. I don't think it's what our instincts tell us. I think most people's instincts are, of course, we get a security deposit. Of course we do. But I have seen some folding of strong wills when it comes to negotiation, and people will agree to these things. Let me put it in this perspective. If a seller is selling their property and they're saying, yeah, I just need a month, it's not going to be a big deal. I'm totally going to follow all the rules and everything will be great. So because I've said these things, we should not talk about rental payments or security deposits or short-term rental agreements. Listen, if that's the case, then what does it matter if we have a short-term rental agreement in place? You've just told me you're going to do everything right. So what does it matter if we have this rental agreement in place? It won't affect you at all if you do everything right. It'll be great for you and it'll be great for me. It's a catch-22 scenario for someone who makes those statements. Like, you can't win with them. You have to put this agreement in place and you have to have money attached to it because, let's face it, you need consequences sometimes or the threat of consequences to have people behave. And that's just how it is. So make sure you have a big security deposit in there. And by the way, the amounts are really important too. And I think the amounts can be bigger than a regular rental because you know what? They just usually just had some proceeds that would come out of their closing. And you can apply those to a security deposit immediately and be held, right? Because let's face it, the easiest remedy for a lot of the problems that may arise from this rental agreement is to just keep that security deposit. And because we all know that it takes a lot of money for it to be even remotely worth pursuing somebody for damages. If you've ever been in the situation of owning a rental and tried to go collect on your damages, it's not a good situation. It can be miserable, and also you probably won't get anything. All right, moving on. Right of entry. Seller shall provide buyer with a duplicate master key and or code to the keyless lock system, if applicable, to the property at closing. Buyer may enter the property during reasonable hours with 24-hour notice for purposes relating to the landlord-tenant relationship between buyer and seller. If seller is not present at the property, then buyer will have the same right to make such entries by duplicate master key and or code to the keyless lock system. If, in buyer's opinion, there exists an emergency or a violation of the leaseback exists, buyer may enter without notice at any time for any inspection, repair, or to determine the condition or occupancy of the property. This brings up a really good point. If you are entering into this situation and you know well in advance that there is going to be a short-term rental agreement, should you waive your final inspection or walkthrough? No way. Like, that walkthrough is always important regardless of the situation, and you could argue that it's even more important now because you want to see the condition of the property before you you own it, right? You want to establish a baseline of what that property looks like always before you close. That way, when they become a tenant, let's just face it, when people become tenants, they treat that property as if they don't own it. And there is a difference. And yes, there are plenty of people who will treat it with plenty of respect, and there are an equal number of people who will treat it like they don't own it. So make sure you go in there and inspect that property before you close and document it in some way so you can have some baseline. Because it could be 30 days is a long time for people to occupy and destroy things. Delivery of possession to buyer. Upon expiration of the rental period, seller agrees to deliver physical possession of the property to the buyer in substantially the same general condition as per section 10.3 of the REFC, including repairs and maintenance, except for ordinary wear and tear, and as provided in section 7. And then we're gonna kind of cruise past some of these. No alterations, damage to property. Of course, they don't have the ability to change anything in there. They don't have the ability to paint. You only really want them making small repairs, no major repairs. You don't want them handling that. You want to handle that. All right, let's talk about default. The following events shall constitute events of default of the leaseback: failure to pay any rent, deposits, or other amounts agreed to herein, or any other sums due and owing by seller to buyer pursuant to any terms of the leaseback and addenda. Failure to perform any of all part of the leaseback or violation of the leaseback, or any of the rules and regulations adopted by buyer or of any law. Mouthful. Seller abandonment of the premises. Abandonment is hereby agreed to mean sellers absent from the premises for 15 consecutive days without first notifying buyer in writing and with rent unpaid and no reasonable evidence the seller is occupying the property, other than items or personal belongings left on the property or by vacating the property without providing appropriate notice. That's a really important sentence there. People do just leave in the middle of the night and don't tell you about it, and then you could wait an extended period of time before you take possession. Know that you do have the right there. D, violation by seller and occupant or any guest of any state, federal, local law or ordinance, including the violation of any such law by an occupant or resident while living in the property, regardless of where the violation occurs. I don't know that I can provide any context to that. If seller holds over and fails to vacate on or before the required move-out date, the end of the current lease term, the end of the month or any renewal extension period, or the move-out date agreed to by both parties, any remedies for default on the lease back shall be controlled under Utah law. Again, all we're doing is emphasizing the need for us to have really good rental payments and really good deposits here. All right, moving on to paragraph 9, penalty for holdover tenancy. Seller shall be liable to pay rent for the holdover period and to indemnify buyer for damages including, but not limited to, rental loss, lodging expenses, and attorney's fees. Seller shall be liable to buyer for all costs incurred as a result of any breach by seller. Holdover rent should be determined by prorating the rent in section 2 of the leaseback. This is really important when we're as we discussed before, the entire point of this document is to protect everybody from legal liability. And by the way, if they all of a sudden do not perform and want to stay longer than they are welcome, and paragraph 9 is a really good place to apply pressure. And so in the event, okay, and this is why, think about the consequences here. In the event the rent amount in section 2 of the leaseback is left blank or $0, buyer and seller agree that the rent in the holdover period shall be X per day and due immediately on a daily basis. Buyer acceptance of daily rent during the holdover period does not constitute an extension of the rental period, and buyer may elect to go through the eviction process to have seller removed from the property. So if you do agree to $0, this is where you can hold their feet to the fire. That amount, in my opinion, should not be a small amount. It should be a painful amount in 9A there, a painful amount of money every single day until they leave. Yeah, they may not pay it because they're giving you problems anyway, but this is where you can apply some pressure and get them and hopefully exit that situation. Okay. Use of the property, I think we would understand that. Liability, let's talk about that. It is agreed intent of the leaseback that buyer shall not be liable for personal injury or damage to or loss of seller's personal property unless caused by gross negligence of buyer, its agents, management, or assigned. Buyer and seller agree that buyer shall not be liable for any damages directly or indirectly caused by any other occupant, resident, tenant, or guest. Buyer shall not be liable for seller for any other type of damages from fire, flood, water leaks, theft, rain, hail, ice, snow, smoke, structural problems, environmental issues, toxins, mold, or mildew contaminated left by prior residents, explosions, interruptions of utilities, acts of God, or negligent behavior of buyer or its agents unless such injury or damage is caused by gross negligence of buyer or its agent. Wow. That should seem self-explanatory there. That's why we have rental policies to cover us. Seller's insurance. So we talked about those two things, so we're not going to repeat them. And there's an agency paragraph. I think we all understand that, and additional terms. So you can add a few things in there that are important. That might include the removal of certain fixtures, or make sure that the tenant takes things away. Or, by the way, just have them clean it when they're done. Maybe that's something we want to throw in there. All right. Does anybody have any questions related to the short-term leaseback agreement? That's just a fun, great document. If Will were here, he'd be so excited that we read the short-term leaseback agreement. I'm just so excited. It is 1:47. There are a couple other documents that we had, but they are not easily plowed through in 10 minutes or so. So, does anybody have anything else they want to discuss? Current transactional issues they're working on, or just a general comment? Take it away if you do, because otherwise, we're going to wrap this up. All right, y'all, that feels like the end of